In our world today, young people have so many choices, lots of distractions as well. With God calling all sorts of people to follow Him, how are we going to hear His voice, and how are we going to know that God is calling us to serve? Well, today we are joined by Sister Georgeann Parizek, and she's going to be sharing with us her story, how she first heard the call and how she knew she was called to serve. Welcome to our program called To Serve. Today we're joined by Sister Georgeann, who is not from the Diocese of Baton Rouge, but currently serving here at this time. And she's going to give us a little bit of an insight into how she made her way into Baton Rouge and into the ministry to which God called her. So Sister Georgeann, welcome. And we'd like to ask you today, as a young woman, how did God call you? How did you know that God was calling you to religious life?
Well, as in all of life, everything is a journey. And I think the seeds of religious life, or God's call, to be more precise, really begin when you're a young child. They begin with your understanding of community that is given to you often by your parents. And I say that because sometimes the vocation isn't until later, until a person really has an experience of community. I was very blessed with a family that had a very strong focus on family, on education, particularly from my mother, Catholic education, and from my mother, faith. My father, I know, really had a belief in God, but he was not one who really was drawn towards an institutional religion. But he supported my mother's faith and her faith in our being raised within the Catholic tradition. So that was something from the beginning, the way we were involved in church life, parish life. I think the other aspect as a young child was definitely the influence of the women religious that were responsible for the education of our parish grade school. The women religious that educated us were out of Mundelein, Illinois. They were the BVMs, as we called them, the Sisters of Charity of the BVMs out of Mundelein. And they were, I came through elementary education at the time of Vatican II. I started in my earlier years with the Baltimore Catechism, and by 7th and 8th grade, Vatican II had come in. And these women religious were really women who began to understand the role of laity, and they began to educate us about our religious responsibilities, our faith responsibilities, because of our Catholicism, because of the presence of Christ in the world, really began to show us how to go out into the world as faith-filled Christians taking on the challenges of the world. That we were given the gift of education of faith, and out of that there was a real responsibility. I laugh about this because even though during those years I might have, as all of us did, they put forth the idea of vocation. We had visitors from all over the world coming in to talk to us about being a missionary for the love of Christ. But there, as only in a very young mind, part of the balance between the sense of cloister in religious life and the call to go out and be among the people of God really caused me to not really give it serious consideration at that time. As only a child can say in speaking with God, it was, as long as we have those habits, I will never enter religious life. I mean, I can remember, as only a child can say, there was something about God's presence in the world that said we should not be separated from the world. And so I just kind of said, well, as long as we have these cloisters and these habits and things, I'm off the hook. And then my life proceeded. A high school and a public high school where almost every student who came to that high school was from a Catholic feeder school. It was very much like being in a Catholic high school. There were over 3,000 students in that public high school, and yet it was a very warm and wonderful place to be. I always enjoyed working with children. I babysat from a very early age and knew I had a real gift, a real drawing to work with children. But I was not strong at that time academically. I hadn't necessarily focused on that. So it was interesting that after high school, I did not pursue a college education. I went right into the world of working in an office. Coming out of church one day, one of the sisters in the parish said, would you ever be able to help us with some of the after-school sports programs? And I said, I think I could probably free up some time. And so I started working with children again and loved it. And through that experience, people in that parish community really encouraged me to further my education and maybe go into elementary education. Still in the back was always the question of could this be an invitation also for vocation and religious life? But I did the normal things: dating, really being totally involved in life at the university, playing intercollegiate sports, that kind of thing. From there, and this is where my life really probably took more of a change. After graduation, I did the kind of normal things one does. I interviewed for different school systems, knowing I did not want to really go into public education because in public education it seemed to me there was no autonomy. You were on this page on this day in this book, or you were in this page doing this activity on this day. So I really was looking at the parochial school system or one of the smaller systems in the surrounding area in Omaha. Well, I received a call one day while I was doing the search for schools, and it was from Sister Helen Condon, who was the headmistress of Duchesne Academy in Omaha, Nebraska. And she had contacted the university where I had gone to school, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and had spoken with the department director asking for recommendations of someone who could do a multiple layer of like work within the school, jobs, employment. So she, at that point, this director whom I had worked for at the university gave her my name, and my thought was, well, I've done this interview, that interview, and I'll go and do this interview. And I left saying, well, we'll see where God takes me, and let's see who calls. And sure enough, the first call that I received was from Sister Helen Condon, who asked me to come in and to do a second interview, and then at that point to sign a contract. And so at that time, I started teaching at the high school level. However, my biggest love was really for elementary, but I thought, well, I can do anything for a year. This is a nice job. I'll get my feet wet. I'm doing things I love to do. I was coaching. They needed someone to do the direction of their athletic program, and I also had the loving title of coordinator of discipline for a girls' high school. So it was a lot of fun, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it, and I really began to see where the philosophy of the women religious, the religious of the Sacred Heart, their philosophy towards education, towards a real strong faith that impels one to act, that education, really quality education is very important for young women, but it has to be rooted in something very solid, one's faith. And the more I worked with them, the more I began to put it, to kind of let the fire kind of burn a little more. But I was still dating and still enjoying life as a single woman and doing many things in life.
It sounds as if in where you were, that there were a presence of a lot of sisters. I know that many people today will say, you know, we don't really see the sisters around so much anymore, not like they used to be so visible in schools and in other areas. So clearly where you were, there was a pretty healthy presence of the sisters, because it sounds as if both in education and in the church life as a whole, you ran into a lot of religious women who were able to give you an example of what religious life might look like.
That is very true. And the difference being is that by the time I was working with the women religious at Georgeann, they were no longer in the formal habits. They had really transitioned to more contemporary dress, which was much more appealing to me because they weren't separated from the world. And we were invited into that world of whether it was education or prayer, or just even outside of school activities. You know, after faculty meetings, we might go to a local like restaurant and have a meal together that was outside of just the school and work environment. So you began to see and experience women religious as really being a part of, and yet not a part of the world and a part of religious life. So there was a really wonderful fit. After about 5 years of high school work, excuse me, I really thought, you know, I really got into education because I loved elementary. And you could do so much more in terms of children really taking on the responsibility that whatever their actions were, because I was working with discipline, they needed to realize that their choices needed to be made in a faith context. And when they didn't make a choice that was helpful to the school community, it took away from the building of community. And so that there needed to be a way of working with children so that they could see the choices that they made every day either built up the community or took away from the community. I was set to leave, and one of the sisters I had worked as a colleague with in the school setting had been gone for about a year, finishing up her administrative degree. She took me aside and said, I'm coming on as the headmistress next year. It hasn't been announced, but I know you're thinking of leaving this setting for an elementary setting. If you would just stay one more year so that I'm not taking on many tasks my first year, if you're interested in and open to moving somewhere, if there's an opening in one of our schools where there is an elementary school, I can do what I can to see if we can make that happen. So I ended up then staying a year. Then I moved to Chicago, where our order that I'm now a member of had a K through 12 school. And I became the dean of students for the girls pre-K, K through 8th grade, which I loved. At that time, and this kind of gets into the vocation story, I was dating a really wonderful young man. And the relationship had progressed to the point where we were really seriously looking at marriage. And at that point, when you talk about the fidelity of relationships, one has to be able to be very free to enter into a relationship, whether it's religious life or marriage. And you have to enter into that with openness, with, as we say in the French word, disponibility. You have to be able to be free to do that without any
undue
wonderings.
Attachments. Yes.
Exactly. So I had this conversation with this young man, and I said, you know, I've always had this little thread of wonder about if I did have a vocation to religious life. I had come to know that these women, the religious of the Sacred Heart, were more interested in what was right for each individual person as opposed to always what was right for the religious order. A vocation for the sake of a vocation for someone who isn't going to be at peace is not helpful to anyone, just like as in a marriage. Marriage to the wrong person for the wrong reasons does not create a happy marriage. So I really trusted these sisters that if I began this process at any point, they would say to me, you know, you're a wonderful person, you've got many talents, but religious life isn't, at least here, isn't going to be what we would recommend for you.
So there was a level of trust in the formation process.
Oh,
that
definitely.
They're not just trying to get numbers, but really trying to help people find their vocation.
Exactly, exactly. Where is God calling you? Where will you really find the depth of your fulfillment as a child of God?
Absolutely.
So,
on that note, we're going to take just a quick break. We're about halfway through the show now. And when we come back, we'll walk a little bit into transition from teacher to religious sister and how that transition happened in your life. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Called to Serve. Our guest today is Sister Georgeann Parizek, and she's telling us a lot about how education played such an important role in her initial discernment to religious life, but is now really getting to the meat of how does one make the transition from I want to teach to I want to be in a religious congregation, because one can be a married teacher, one can be a lay teacher their whole lives, but not take that step into religious life. And so we want to hear a little bit about your journey then of not only the vocation of the work, the teaching, but also the vocation to the community. How did you then begin to discern that not only am I called to be a part of the work that these women are doing, but also to be a part of the community of these women? How did you make that transition?
oh, that's a different way of asking a question that let me think about that just a second. I didn't see it as for them a major transition. It was one and the same. The way they educated was the way they were as women religious. And what really struck me at that time now, because several years have passed, and there were changes happening throughout the world in the way that the church was being involved in the world. The kind of motto that companies would have, we would call a charism. And the charism of the religious of the Sacred Heart was to in the old language, was to glorify and make known the heart of Christ throughout the world. The order that interested me, whereas the order I was educated with was more of a regional, local order, this order was an international order. This order had a focus of education locally, but it was always turned outward towards the needs of the world. It was a way of life that looked at putting personal needs, in a sense, aside for the greater whole, for the greater, in a sense, glory of God. This order really, because of its internationality, really was focusing on the cry of the poor, which, as you realize, was the focus of what the church was really moving towards as in its focus as well. The social teachings of the church became paramount in how we were educating, the way we were educating. And there was always a freshness about how we approached education, because it was always rooted in the love of the heart of Christ. And that would have been the underscoring mark, was how is what we are doing making a difference to bring the love of the heart of Christ, which is the knowledge of God and the experience of God, into the world. And I think that looped me back to the earlier questions as a child. You know, how can I be more faithful to what God is inviting me to? So I think it was really an interesting thing as I came to know and experience the history and the tradition of this order that really started to ignite a kind of fire of love for the children of the world, the places in the world where there is suffering, and that through education, through women who, the foundation of our order was by Saint Madeleine Sophie Barra in France, and it was really to use education in the faith context to educate women, to educate a family, to create social change that would then help the poor and the suffering of the world. So when you get a kind of a global experience of what religious life is and can be, you want to, there's a call that you want to be a part of that.
I love hearing the way that they are integrated, because I think in many of a modern mind, if you're educating someone, you're giving them knowledge, facts, science, which has nothing to do with faith.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds as if what you found was a charism that said education itself is a part of loving Christ, is
Mm-hmm.
a part of that faith
Mm-hmm.
life, and that they're not separated. It's not, well, we have school and then we'll have religious instruction
Mm-hmm.
later,
Mm-hmm.
but that all of this knowledge, all of this empowerment is happening as a part of our Christian vocation and as a
Exactly.
part of the heart of Christ. That's an exciting way of looking at it, because I think in many modern ways of thinking, the two are so separate as to be irreconcilable. And you have that real vision of the two can not only be together, but that they enhance one another.
Exactly.
And make one another stronger. I find that to be a fascinating approach that they have for education and your charism.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we have a network of schools in this country and now Canada, 22 schools, but we also have an international connection. And so when things are happening in Egypt, we're in Egypt. We know when our sisters are being moved out of the city because there are problems there. We were in China and expelled from China, and we're now back. We're in Japan, we're in Korea. When things happen in this country at a level of government, we know that they're affecting our sisters across the world. And so therefore, your education, your knowledge has got to call into question how you are a citizen of the world. So it is really a faith that impels one to action. There is a social responsibility element to it all. The other thing that I find within our order that really was very comfortable for me, because of my family operated as a community where we definitely had the sense of shared goods. And I remember several years ago listening to at a homily, one of the priests saying, well, you know, it's too bad today no one is living out the common purse that the apostles lived at. And I just wanted to put my hand up in the back of the church and say, you know, many religious orders really do that. You take a vow of personal poverty so that your whatever your remuneration is from your ministry, if you're reimbursed for your ministry, it is put at the service of the order for the service of others. And so you do share all things in common. You do your community budget based on to live the way you can live as simply as possible, so that there are resources for others to be able to do the work that God is calling them to do, to serve the needs of others. And it was all those kinds of things that I began to learn about this order that really kind of invited me. Besides the joy of the women I was working with, the generosity in their hearts, the simplicity of their living. And our vow formula begins, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, trusting in the fidelity of God and the love of my sisters, I make these vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Knowing that chastity, we're talking about the love of God. It is, just as vows that married couples take. When they take their vows, it really is a vow of chastity to each other. So the vows are really something that, as opposed to being a burden, are something that really frees you to be about the work of God without hopefully the trappings of the world, in a sense.
So you saw all of these things that made this group, this community, very attractive. How did you end up saying yes and then taking vows yourself? Was there any particular time, or was there any particular experience that made you say, I want to go from working with them to being one of them?
It's actually a dialogue, because yes, you at each step of the way, whether from your candidate year, your novitiate years, your year as a young professed, at each juncture, you make the request to say, this seems right for me. I would like to continue in my journey. And the order is speaking back, saying, yes, we seem to be in a sense communion. We're together, and therefore let's move forward to the next step. You don't necessarily, if at some point it wasn't working for either me or for the order, I think either one of us could have said it's not working, you move back. And that's what's the beauty of formation is that people think it's like it's a once, I made this step and now it's all the way in. It's almost like an engagement period. A couple gets engaged, and the farther they get into the engagement, it either becomes the right move, or they begin to say, we need to move back out of this. We need to call this off. And with religious life, it's a lot of the same. And I think that maybe is one thing young people don't understand. And I say young people, I was not a, quote, young person. Many people in our order did not enter until they were at least 21, 22, 23. As you can tell from my journey of history, I've been through college. I had worked 5 years. So I was in my late 20s before I even began to pursue this. I had been in several very nice relationships with young men, wonderful men. But in the fidelity of those relationships and in the honesty of that relationship, I needed to move on. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I'm not at this moment even sure what your question was. but
well, you really are, because what you're really telling us is, the discernment process, because a lot of this program is about how do people hear the call of God? Mm-hmm. How do they say yes? How do they have the courage to finally say, I'm not necessarily going to chase after money or other things that people tell me are important. And so you really are answering the question, though in a more general way, that there are certain very beautiful things that you saw that drew you. Exactly. And so when God was calling you, it wasn't necessarily I was at a retreat and I heard the voice of God.
Yeah, no, yes,
but
yes.
Not every calling is that way.
No.
Some of them simply come about by, as I entered more and more, I felt more and more, this is right. I felt more and more at home, and therefore it just naturally grew into a vocation. So certainly, I mean, this really is for us a good and constant example of the fact that the example that we set, the joy that we have, will help to call others. So I want to thank you for joining us today.
No problem. Thank
sharing
you.
that testimony with us. And I do want to just once again remind our audience to continue to pray for all of those religious sisters, brothers, priests who are here in our diocese that that are doing the full-time ministry. Please continue to pray for young people, that they might say yes to the call, and that they too might find their own way to serve the Lord and to serve the people of God. We thank you for watching, and remember, God is still calling many to serve.